All right, welcome to Gospel Perspectives on World History, and I'm your host, Michael Stone. Thank you for joining us as we continue looking at the secular history of the world through the lens of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. While this podcast is primarily geared towards members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, anyone who has an interest in topics of faith and history are welcome to join us. And as an important legal notice, while I do intend to center what I share as much as possible on the verified details of the historical record and on ancient and modern scriptures approved by the Church, I do want to stress that the views I share here do not necessarily represent official doctrine, policy, or the views of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that I take full responsibility for the content and programming of this podcast. So today, we will visit some of the most celebrated moments in Greek history as we enter what is often referred to as its golden age. From the contributions of some of history's most noted mathematicians, sculptors, and philosophers, as well as some of the most memorable conflicts that have been popularized into several movies, we will today examine, perhaps more critically than most are used to, Greece's classical age. So, I'll begin with a quote here. It was Socrates who once said that the unexamined life is the one not worth living. That sentiment could well be applied to the history we will discuss today as a cursory, superficial retelling of the stories I was taught in school. It would be easy for me to do and leave us with some easy lessons to learn from. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I had to, as I usually do before I teach a history lesson or make one of these episodes, double check my sources and compare what I know with the most recent scholarship that I can find. And today, I can safely say that what I have learned has upended one key narrative that I would normally share regarding this period of history. And by the end of this episode, you may well discover a few other likely unintended meanings of Socrates' quote that might raise more questions than answers. History, always resisting the simple explanation. So, perhaps I should just begin with the facts as we know them. The start of Greece's so-called Golden Age arguably began in a pretty tough bind. In the mid-500s BC, several parts of Greece, namely their colonies in modern-day Turkey, as well as a good chunk of northern Greece, had been conquered by the Persians, ruled by King Darius. Athens, being the democracy it was, it felt quite skittish about the idea of Persia's encroachment towards their little polis, and partly in solidarity with their fellow Greeks, but I suspect probably more so out of self-preservation, the Athenians helped support a rebellion of the captured city-states against the Persian regime. This Ionian rebellion ultimately was unsuccessful, but they did manage to stoke the temper of King Darius, who decided that Athens deserved a swift and brutal response from his forces for daring to interfere with his affairs. In fact, Herodotus, the Greek historian, who, though being one of the first people to profess themselves to be a historian, he did often include a strong pro-Greek bias in his writings. He memorialized the wrath of King Darius by recounting how, after Athens had helped burn down one of his favorite towns in the Ionian rebellion, he made a vow to destroy Athens and even ordered his servants at every meal to say to him, "Sire, remember the Athenians." So, fun little detail. Whether it was true or not, it comes from a Greek source. So, still, it's a fun detail that always gets shared. Anyway, Darius amassed a large fleet of 600 ships filled with thousands of Persian troops, and sent them to Greece with the hopes of installing his own new tyrant in Athens. The Greeks were outnumbered by more than 2-1 in this encounter. But by forcing the Persians to engage them in a swampy marshland, they prevented the Persians from using their devastating cavalries. And this was especially useful because then the Greeks could feel confident in using their hoplites to do their phalanx formations, who used their soldiers as shields in concert with each other to protect their divisions from the ranged fire of the Persian forces. And so because of all this, the Persians were actually driven back, with more than 6,000 of them dying before they could retreat successfully. This battle, known as the Battle of Marathon, took place about 40 kilometers from Athens, which gives rise to the question, what does this place have to do with modern-day marathons? Well, there is a legend of a Greek messenger during this battle who ran, after the battle was finished, he ran the full distance from Marathon to Athens. He had to inform Athens of their soldiers' victory before any retreating Persians might have had the opportunity to eventually raid the city or seize it in false victory. Just saying, hey, yeah, we killed your soldiers, so we can do this kind of thing. That's what the messenger was trying to stop. And so after running nonstop, he is said to have yelled, "We won!" Before dying from exhaustion. Again, another little flair added to the history that, while it may not have happened, it does at least make for a nice story. A story that led to the rise of today's tradition of marathons. So the Persians did not decide to give up entirely on the prospect of conquering Greece, however. Under King Xerxes, the son of Darius, they launched a second invasion of Greece in 480 BC. This time, Xerxes opted to go by land and by sea, sending an even larger fleet as well as tens of thousands of troops into the north of Greece. In response to this threat, the Greek city-states did something they never really effectively did before, and that is that they joined forces in a formal alliance called the Delian League. A defense strategy was agreed on to hold two major choke points to defend Athens. And the big choke point was a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. And Sparta was going to be in charge of holding that pass, chiefly. The Greeks successfully defended that mountain pass until a local Greek resident betrayed the soldiers and let the Persians know of another route they could take to outflank the Spartans. Hearing that the Persians had discovered this new route, King Leonidas of Sparta ordered the majority of his forces to retreat, while he and a reserve group would remain to hold the pass and occupy the Persians as long as possible in order to buy everyone else time to get to safety. This small group is where we get the popular memory of the 300 Spartans. And while I should note that it was 300 Spartans plus around 1,500-ish others, Leonidas and his defenders still should get a great deal of credit, as even then they were still outnumbered by at least 10-1, if not even up to 30-1. And despite those odds, and despite the fact that these defenders did all ultimately die, they were, at the end, successful. They did buy time for their other forces to retreat, allowing them not only to warn Athens that the Persians were coming, but they were also able to help finally fend off the Persians at the Battle of Salamis by evacuating the entire city of Athens and forcing the Persians to do battle strictly on the sea. And after the Persian navy was decimated in this battle, their ground forces were suddenly without any means to resupply. And that forced the now very bitter King Xerxes to call off the invasion and ultimately leave the frustratingly stubborn Greeks alone. The aftermath of the Persian Wars left Athens in ruin, though. And in light of this, the Greek city-states decided to keep the Delian League around, and even agreed to let Athens lead the league. The league was able to coordinate the liberation of other Greek city-states that had been conquered by Persia. And Athens came to rise during this time period not only in its political influence, but in its art, culture, and science as well. And yet, even as Athenian men were enjoying unparalleled equality and prosperity in their democracy, Athens came to install itself as the de facto imperial Greek power over its other city-state friends in the Delian League. Particularly after seeing Athens use the Delian League's funds to build some of the most remarkable and lavish temples in their city, the Spartans decided enough was enough and went to war with Athens, beginning the Peloponnesian War, named after the new league Sparta made. And Athens does not do too well in the Peloponnesian War. I'll just tell you. We'll get into it here as we go along. Sparta does even take over Athens a number of times during the war. But one detail that we'll get to here is one philosopher who lives around this time. So anyway, up until this point, that's basically just the facts of the history of the classical age, a backdrop against which we can better understand Socrates and this narrative that I had discussed at the beginning of the episode. Socrates, the guy who used to be a little easier for me to describe and whose experience used to be this really easy, inspiring story to tell, will be the focus of much of the rest of the episode, for reasons that I'll explain. He is the first of the big three philosophers of classical Greece, and much of what we know of him actually comes to us from his students and admirers, especially Plato. And that is the key problem of telling his story, especially as regarding the circumstances of his trial, conviction, and execution. One detail that we can safely assume to be true is that he was a philosopher, reported by friends and enemies alike to be the man who enjoyed walking about the city of Athens, finding people to talk to, and eventually asking them to call into question what was really real, or what was right and wrong, or what they believed in. Socrates' method of asking questions and allowing his students to answer them for themselves and to therefore, in a way, discover truth on their own terms is actually a teaching technique that is still used today. We call it the Socratic method. The problem is that Socrates' habit of teaching Athenian youth to thus think for themselves was not always well received by the ruling elite. According to what I had been taught growing up, it was the charge of corrupting the Athenian youth, of stirring up trouble by convincing the Athenian youth to think critically about their elders' way of running the city, that ultimately got him tried and executed. This was a story that was useful for discussing the idea of intellectual freedom and even earned Socrates the reputation of being a martyr for that cause. However, as I mentioned before, there's some new considerations that I had just not come across before that I am obligated to share here. For one, this is a story, this flattering story of Socrates relies mostly on the surviving records of Socrates as written by his own students, who would have been motivated to portray him as a martyr after this trial and execution. It is this rare instance that we see that history is not always written by the victor, per se. This narrative, I had been taught, had relied almost exclusively on Plato's record of the trial, who was a fellow philosopher and student of Socrates. And it's only been relatively recently that some historians have come to question Plato's account. And that's because besides Plato, we do have other sources and other key context that we need to take a look at. Aristophanes is an earlier source that we can rely on, who recounts the earlier life of Socrates. He knew the guy while Plato and our other key source, Xenophon, were both infants. The trick with Aristophanes is that he was a playwright whose source is a play called Cloud, and depicts Socrates as a character in that play as an object of light derision and scorn. This character's tendency to make fun of the gods, to teach his students to slick ways to get out of paying their debts, and even advocating for the Athenian youth to beat their parents physically into submission, may have seemed ridiculous and comical at the time the play was written. But for reasons that I'll explain in just a bit, by the time of Socrates' trial, this play and the jurors' memory of this play may have taken on a much darker meaning. Still, a play is not necessarily evidence that would be enough to successfully challenge the idea that Socrates was a martyr to intellectual freedom. Our other key primary source, Xenophon, is also complimentary of Socrates, given that he too, like Plato, was a student. But Xenophon's record has been put into doubt because, one, he was not actually at the trial, and two, many of his claims have been proven demonstrably false by other historical sources. He just keeps on getting the basic facts wrong about other aspects of Greek history around this time. Where I personally begin to see problems for my old way of looking at Socrates is the historical record itself. You see, Socrates had shared with Alcibiades his disdain for some of the weaknesses of Athenian democracy, especially its constitution. Socrates is reported to not have been too flattered by the idea that just common normal people could have such an influence and sway in democracy. He and later Plato expressed the sentiment that we really should just have only the educated people be in charge. And so, more than that, though, Alcibiades went on to actually spark a revolt against the democracy. And he, along with others, violently overthrew the Athenian government, installing an oligarchy, that rule of the few that we talked about in connection with Sparta last time. Worse still, it was another one of Socrates' students, Critias, who led a second violent revolt against the democracy later on. And while Socrates refused to directly cooperate with these regimes, his defenders will note, for example, that he did not obey the revolutionary new government's order to arrest Leon of Salamis. He also didn't exactly do anything to oppose these governments. He didn't warn Leon, for example, or try to help him escape his eventual fate. Nor did Socrates complain when his students set out to banish 5,000 Athenian men, women, and children from the city, or when they executed 1,000 others. And we do not see anywhere in Plato's writings or elsewhere any regret that Socrates may have had about these events, or any complaints that he may have made. So, Socrates had been granted clemency, along with many others, when the Athenian democracy had been reestablished and they had gotten rid of these so-called 30 tyrants. But many Athenians were disturbed to see that he did not stop teaching the way that he did. Most disconcerting to many Athenians was how he continued to invite his students to question the democracy that they had, and to criticize the new Athenian leadership. He even encouraged his students to disregard and not necessarily pay reverence to the gods, which, when one remembers how Critias and Alcibiades had started out their antisocial careers by defacing the gods' likenesses in the city, these details take on an important consideration to take into account when the Athenians decide to try Socrates for impiety and for corrupting the Athenian youth. Ultimately, regardless of what we can determine of his actual guilt or innocence with these charges, he was found guilty and was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock poison. So perhaps now you can begin to see how one might feel a little conflicted about Socrates. Because even if we accept that he was at least passively complicit in the temporary upheaval of Athenian democracy and the death that occurred, how are we fully to know how much the experience had changed him? His other followers, Plato most notably, it did not instigate any civil wars, for instance. Were Alcibiades and Critias exceptions to the rule? Were the Athenians perhaps a little too skittish, too reactionary about Socrates after the uprisings? Or were they justified in preempting him from inspiring another crisis? Unfortunately, I do not know the answers to these questions. I just don't know how guilty or innocent Socrates may have been. But what I can say about this trial is that it raises a number of issues I think a modern audience and Latter-day Saints it should take seriously. Socrates is not the only person in history, after all, to stir up trouble by asking questions or by challenging the status quo. But what my experience in studying Socrates has done for me is point out that simply being someone who raises doubts about the status quo does not necessarily mean that such doubts are always fully justified or unjustified. For every noble social critic we have, like in the Book of Mormon, Abinadi, or in church history, Joseph Smith, or best yet, Jesus Christ, you have other social critics in the scriptural record who could well be guilty of corrupting the youth and be seen much less favorably, like Korihor or Sherem or Nehor in the Book of Mormon. We can look at secular history for these less than savory social critics, like Jean-Paul Marat, whose radical perspectives on the French Revolution directly led to the deaths of hundreds of innocents at the guillotine. Or perhaps, worst of all, you have Adolf Hitler, whose critiques on German society that he made, his observations in Mein Kampf, and notably, were used to indoctrinate a generation of Germans to commit one of history's greatest mass genocides. Fortunately, when it comes to discerning between these differing sources of information, we have a guide for discerning between the philosophies of men and true doctrine. Christ warned us that many false prophets would come, but that we would be able to tell the difference between false and true by looking at the fruit. It is a relief to know that we also have the Holy Ghost, modern revelation from prophets, revelation is recorded in Scripture, and personal revelation to guide us in matters of eternal consequence. I do also believe, however, that going back to that rule of the fruit, that Christ's rule of looking at the fruit or the results of a teaching or a doctrine can apply not just to telling whether or not someone is a true prophet or not in matters of eternal consequence. Telling good from bad fruit is something I personally feel is something we should do with any source of information. When we are presented with information, it is important to ask where it came from. As Christ taught, a good tree cannot bring forth corrupt fruit, and neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. That is why Latter-day Saints, I argue, should care about the character of people we elect for office, for example. Additionally, looking at the context in which the information we come across is generated is important. I had taught only one side of the story of Socrates for 7 years as a teacher because I had just not come across the other side's story up until now. Studying the challenging issues of today from multiple perspectives is imperative in order to more fully understand the truth. We need to be careful and mindful that our diet of information is varied and that we take the time to listen to perspectives that differ from those we already believe. In doing so, we won't always change our opinions, but hopefully we will come to understand that those who disagree with us are not just amoral or unintelligent all the time. All of this brings me back to the quote from Socrates that got us started on this episode today, that the unexamined life is one not worth living. While some of what Socrates may have taught could be held in suspicion, I will personally agree that it is important to examine our lives. Asking questions in good faith should never be punished or discouraged. After all, asking those kinds of questions is what led Joseph Smith to become the vessel for God to restore his church on the earth. And regardless of what Socrates' true legacy may be, our freedom of conscience, our freedom to pursue the truth, wherever it may lead, is something that hopefully will be a protected right always. Both by us individually as we respect others' freedom of conscience and by those in power in business and government. And that ends our episode for today. Unfortunately for the Greeks, we won't leave them in a very good place, as the civil strife that dominated the time of Socrates is not going to end. The Greeks will be left divided and weakened, setting the stage for a previously relatively inconspicuous power to take the reins, to take over Greece and usher in a new kind of Greek empire, the likes of which will leave an impact for the rest of world history. Because next time, we are going to discuss Alexander the Great. Also, if you have enjoyed this podcast, be sure to leave us a review. And if you know others who would enjoy this series, please consider sharing it with them. One easy way to do that is to use the link in the episode description for our show's website and share that on your ward's social media page so that other members of the church can enjoy the show as well. And I would like to thank everyone who has supported the launch of this podcast, including my lovely wife, my kids, and my loving brother-in-law, Spencer, for suggesting that I go through with this idea. And again, thank you for listening, and stay safe out there.